last judgment, sin punishment and act of grace. Fear and terror will befall the people in view of the end and their helplessness, because all but the few faithful to God lack faith in a loving, wise and all-powerful God, in a life after death and in a spiritual kingdom. They believe only what they see and see its downfall, and thus their condition is hopeless. They have valued earthly life too highly, and they now realize their powerlessness to prolong it by 1 hour, and the imperfection of their souls terrifies them, for they fear death. They feel it unconsciously, that the soul is approaching an extremely agonizing state, that there is no extinction for the soul, and in their insufficient maturity of soul they must therefore fear the end or come to faith. The believing person faces the end with peace of mind, knowing that he is protected, as long as he lives on earth. And also the life after his death does not frighten him, it is for him the actual life, which was the purpose and goal of his life on earth. But the last time will be terrible, for all the forces of darkness will come together, will unite and rage against the light on earth to pull it down into darkness. And the faithful will be in extreme distress, from which death will appear to them as redemption. And that is why they long for the last hours, they anxiously await the call from this earth and hope for the coming of the Lord, which precedes the last judgment. And from this they draw the strength to resist. But Satan rages until the last hour has come. Men excel in cruelty and proceed outrageously against the faithful. Then judgment comes upon them. Flames burst out of the earth and consume everything they seize. And the people see death before their eyes, which they cannot escape. But their distress and fear do not outweigh the measure of sins they have taken upon themselves in the time of persecution against those who are faithful to God. This measure is overflowing and can only be paid off by the banishment in the solid matter, that the beingness in it carries off the guilt through a long time of captivity. And no man will escape his fate which he has created for himself by his way of life. The anguish and the horror will be exceedingly great for the guilty. The bliss at the coming of the Lord likewise for the faithful, and all misery on earth will have an end for a long time. People cannot imagine the process that will take place at the last judgment. The power of God will punish everything that is contrary to him. Satan himself will be bound, and with him all powers that were in bondage to him. And the earth will be a place of living devils at that time, fully in the power of their Lord. But not forced, but voluntarily they followed him, and therefore also all opponents of God who will now feel the wrath of God. They have to atone for their sinfulness. They have to take unspeakable agonies upon themselves because they are in extreme remoteness from God, and this means total powerlessness and hardest imprisonment, a state which is unimaginably agonizing for the once powerful spiritual being able to move in freedom. And nevertheless also this act of banishing is in the firmest matter is an act of grace of God, in order to help this spiritual to become free, to give it the possibility to reach the original state again. But the magnitude of the guilt of sin also determines the measure of the torments. The torments are certainly a punishment, an expiation for the sins, but at the same time a means of improvement, a means for the transformation of the spiritual being, which is completely distant from God, into beings which strive for God. That this means is of such a hardness, which seems cruel to men, is the fault of mankind itself in the last time on this earth, because the spiritual, which is already in the stage of free will, regresses to the utmost depth, in spite of all God's obliging help, which would like to spiritual from this. People make a mockery of God's love, they do not pay attention to his word, not to his servants and prophets. They let all earthly events pass them by without any impression, their free will turns downwards, towards the one who fights against God, and thus they become like him. This can only result in a complete banishment from God, and this complete banishment is always a state of greatest agony, because only the closeness to God is happy for the being, and the distance from God completely contradicts the original state of the being. If God now wants to give the fallen being the opportunity to return to him, then it has to go through the agonies of the distance from him, so that it changes of its own will and strives towards God again. Initially, however, it is so opposed to God that it does not muster this will, and therefore the stay in the solid matter lasts endlessly long times. But God knows when the stubbornness of the will begins to weaken, and he then also loosens the cover of the spiritual, and the faster, the more yielding the spiritual shows itself in the form. This is the only way on which the spiritual can again reach the state of free will, which now again confronts it with the decision. Because this must be taken absolutely in complete freedom of will. So also the coming judgment is only an act for the recovery of the spiritual, although it is connected with a hard atonement for the sin measure, the sins that people will incur in the last time before the end. An upward development, that is transformation of the will on this earth, does not exist anymore, and therefore all life is ended. A time in God-connectedness and guiltlessness begins again for the few whom God takes from the earth before, whom he has determined for the procreation of the human race, after all other people have been deprived of their bodily life. They can therefore no longer oppress the few good people who are faithful to God. For this is the end, that God separates the good from the bad, that he rewards the good and punishes the bad, so that the former may lead a paradisiacal life on the new earth, and the latter are condemned to endless imprisonment. Amen.